You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 480 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Michael Maharrey. He is the communications director at the 10th Amendment Center and the managing editor of the Schiff Gold website. He is the host of several podcasts, including the Friday Gold Wrap and Thoughts from Maharrey Head. He's also the author of, I think, 4 books now, including one titled Constitution Owner's Manual that I definitely recommend you check out. And he actually was on the show to talk about that in the past. And that episode will be linked in the show notes page. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Kyle. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have a really unique perspective to talk to you about today because not only do you work at the 10th Amendment Center, where you talk about how the government is trampling on our rights, and we could talk about like the constitutional authorities and all that about the kind of lockdown that we're currently under, but you also, do the Schiff Gold Wrap, and that means you understand economics and why injecting $2.2 trillion into the economy probably isn't the best idea, even though it, every single congressperson except Thomas Massey doesn't agree. But the other element you have on today's show is your history and your roots of Kentucky, and that's really the big story I had. For today's show I think will encompass a lot of what we want to talk about. And that is where you had a church in Kentucky stand up and try to open, and the government seems to have used their police thuds to come down pretty hard on them. So I'll kind of let you tell the story. And I think you'll have an interesting perspective here, because I think it's going to be very important to the culture, to understand the culture and why the people, thought that attending church was so important, that this whole conflict is set up here.
Yeah, well, first off, Baby Bashir, the governor of Kentucky, I call him Baby Bashir because his daddy was governor too. He's been one of probably the most aggressive of the governors, not quite to the level of maybe Cuomo or Gavin Newsom out in California, but he's been pretty close to the top in terms of really ratcheting things down. He was ratcheting things down early, and it's really weird because he's kind of created this cult following out of this, and it really goes to this whole thing. I wrote an article for the Libertarian Institute, basically making the case that most politicians are sociopaths, and that's one of the signs of a sociopath, that you want to make everything about yourself, and Bashir has definitely done that. But he did. He's basically locked the entire state down in no gatherings of more than like however many people. I think 10. And extreme. Basically, it's house arrest in Kentucky, and that includes going to worship services and on Easter Sunday. And there's one church in particular that was in Bullitt County, which is a kind of a suburb of Louisville. But there were other churches as well that held services, actually. And some of them got away with it without getting the police attention. But these folks in Bullitt County had a church service, and the state police showed up, recorded all their license plates, and left notes on their car. And basically, the plan is to require everybody who attended this worship service to quarantine for 14 days, I guess under penalty of law. I'm not quite clear on how they're planning on enforcing it, but I think there are the possibility of misdemeanor charges, if I'm not mistaken. And I actually had a couple of friends that went to this service and got the notices, and they've very emphatically informed me that they're not planning on quarantining. So we'll see how all of that plays out. But it goes to show just how far this has gone, and I think we've gotten to the point where a lot of government figures, a lot of politicians, a lot of bureaucrats are using this as an opportunity to see how far they can push, to see how much power they can grab, to see just how far that they can go. And, shutting down a church in Kentucky, you kind of mentioned the cultural aspect of it. Kentucky's in the buckle of the Bible Belt. And, I think for some people it was a little bit of a stand on principle that you're not going to tell us what to do, which is also something that's very ingrained in Kentucky culture. But, for a lot of people, attending worship service is a very important part of their lives. To have the governor say, you can't do that. And if you do, we're going to punish you with the force of law. That rubs a lot of people really the wrong way. Now, the sad part of this story is I think public opinion is largely against these folks. I think most people in Kentucky are perfectly happy to have the governor dictate to them to stay in their house because they're scared and they think it's the best thing. And when people are scared, they will pretty much give up all of their freedoms for the illusion of security that the government gives them. And that's what's really the saddest thing. And not just in Kentucky. To me, this whole episode has really, honestly, kind of dashed what little hope I had for liberty, because it seems like the vast majority of people in the United States are perfectly happy to have things dictated to them from people that they consider to be their authorities.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I want to ask you, which is I'm in a position where the way I understand the coronavirus and, the threat to me and the people around me, I'd rather not have the thing. And so I'm going to take precautions while I'm going to go out, and I'm going to go out as little as possible. And honestly, just the way my life kind of works out, it's pretty easy for me not to go out a whole lot. It seems to me to be somewhat foolish to go to a rally like the people in Michigan did, where you have people taking selfies with each other and stuff like that. And so I'm in a position where I really disagree that the government doesn't have the ability to take away my right to assemble, and that I should be able to attend church on, Sunday should I want to. But, for my own personal life, I'm making that calculation. But I don't want to give the government the right this time, because next time it may be that I look at the thing and I may say, hey, I actually think this is just a bad flu season and I'm not worried about getting the flu. So I'm willing to go, I don't want to have my rights violated. So, I find that the predicament that I'm in, and I think a lot of libertarians are in the same position, where we have this, great instinct to kind of buck authority, but at the same time, that this is one of the few times that we not agree with what the heavy hand of the government, but in the general course of the action. And so what's the guy to do? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, that's the struggle. I mean, I kind of went into it, I think, at kind of a position that you're in, relatively concerned about the virus and the potential of it spreading, and worrying about the peak and the overwhelming healthcare system, all of those things that were talked about. I honestly have come to a position where I'm a little bit more skeptical that this thing was quite the danger that we were being told. But that said, I'm not a scientist, and I can't make that decision for you, and you can't make those decisions for me. And this is where things, I think, there's a couple of things that have really kind of struck me in this. The first thing is the lack of good information is disturbing. It's like, who do you trust? And those of us that are in the world of libertarianism, we tend not to trust anybody, which I think is healthy in this day and age. But, where do you get good information? I don't trust the CDC or what the WHO is telling me or what Donald Trump tells me. On the other hand, it's hard to vet information. And I wonder how different it would be if we lived in a more free society, in a more truly free market society, where information wasn't almost completely controlled by the government. Most people, your average person out there, trust government authority, which I think is stupid. But government authority basically has a monopoly on information. I mean, I just read today that the Facebook is planning on directing anybody who has posted what they consider to be, bad information about coronavirus or untrue information. They're going to direct them to the WHO. Well, how the hell do I know that the WHO is any more accurate than this other information? We have to live in a world where we have access to all kinds of information so that we can make good decisions. That's the first thing. I really do wonder how different it would be if the government wasn't the gatekeeper of all information. You can't answer that question because we live in a world where the government is the gatekeeper. The other thing that's really struck me, and this is the thing that your point goes to, is that every decision is a cost-benefit analysis. Anything that we decide, we always look at the cost and benefit when we're faced with a decision. And those decisions are going to be different from different people because we all have different preferences. We all have different risk tolerances. We all have different situations in our lives. You know, I personally being particularly careful because my mom is in a demographic that could be susceptible to much more harm from this virus. But other people have different situations. And to have these one size fits all dictates from government just trashes on all of our ability to make these calculations. And I really feel like that we've gone way too far in the direction of do everything we can to mitigate this virus without considering the economic consequences of what's going on, a complete shutdown of the economy. And even if you accept all of the worst doomsday predictions about the coronavirus, you still have to take into account the economic consequences of what you're doing. There's another side of this equation that nobody's considering. So there's a great lack of, number one, good information, and number two, there's a great lack of true calculus and true decision making because people are disregarding huge chunks of information that they don't think is relevant right now. So it's really a difficult situation to kind of navigate your way through because we are going to come to different conclusions, and that brings up all the questions. Well, if you're not going to cooperate, then we have to force you to cooperate. I will always contend, though, that ultimately, if your position is I have to hit you to make you do what I think is best, then your argument's probably not very persuasive.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the other things that I've been thinking is just, at least for now, the violence that the state has used to enforce its lockdowns has been I don't want to say minimal, but it hasn't been to the level of shooting people who are violating the social distancing. You've read stories about people in New York being arrested for social distance or for violating social distancing orders with somebody who they lived indoors with. So that, they're indoors with the person, they go outdoors with the person. Now they both get thrown in jail in holding cells with dozens of other people. Who knows how many? Right. Or, the guy in Philadelphia who got drug off of the bus. But, fortunately, it's, just that. And they're not, shooting the guy who's, has a fever and is trying to go somewhere in public or something like that. But it does seem to me that, it could eventually escalate to that point. And that's something that we also have to factor in when we're taking these steps. And also just, the ability of people to make their own decisions. I mean, I think, unfortunately, so many people do trust the government and listen to the CDC's recommendation not to wear a mask. And so, the government will tell you the wrong thing sometimes. Listening to Trump or Nancy Pelosi about the, upcoming coronavirus would have had you misled both ways.
Right.
And so I don't know. I guess, that's the other thing I want to cover are just to, I guess, ask you here about this is how do you make your decision and like where are you going for some news about the coronavirus?
Well, here's let me just kind of add to your point. One of the things that we really have learned about government is, or I not learned for the first time, but I guess it's been emphasized, we're relearning, is the abysmal failure of central planning. Because in the first place, like you said, I remember the dark days of history 4 weeks ago when they were telling me that it wasn't any use to wear a mask. And now we've got people in New York saying if you don't wear a mask, you're going to go to jail, I guess. So, you get conflicting things. And then things are just arbitrary. I was talking to my wife about this today. I think it's here in Florida that pet grooming has been deemed non-essential. Okay. So if you own a pet grooming business, you're shut down. But pet feeding is obviously something that is essential. So like your big box PetSmarts are open. Now they also happen to have grooming businesses within those stores, right? They're allowed to do their grooming, but the groomer who only grooms is shut down. Now, in what world does that make any sense? If it's dangerous to groom dogs, it's dangerous to groom dogs no matter what store you happen. So you have all of these arbitrary rules that make no sense, that aren't doing anything to really make us safer, and that are probably creating a false sense of safety. I mean, for God's sake, I've been in Walmart. There ain't a lot of social distancing going on. I mean, you can't do social distancing in a 3-foot wide aisle. It just doesn't work. So the idea that these rules and these dictates are going to make us safer is absurd. I think you're a lot better off, making your own decisions about when, if I'm going to go out, where I'm going to go, whether I'm going to wear a mask, making sure you're handling your hygiene, doing these things, making those decisions for yourself. You're going to be a lot better off than following the dictates of the government, which don't make any damn sense in the first place. As far as your question about where to get news, I've been trying to really look at a broad range of sources. I do look at some of the CDC and the WHO stuff. I've read, some alternative press. I've tried to ask questions to people that I know and trust. That's really probably where I've gotten my best information. I know some people that are in the medical field. I know some people with science backgrounds, and they've pointed me to some good resources. But I think in any situation, whether it's something like this or, we talk about getting information about war, anything, I think it's important to try to find a variety of sources and then kind of put all of it together and try to come to a logical conclusion based on a wide range of opinions that kind of make sense and that work. Not sticking to just being the Fox News or just being that one website that you happen to like. Try to get a variety of ideas that'll help expand your thinking.
I think that's been one of the hard things. One of the things that's been exemplified here for me. I think probably for me and you, we have like websites we go to and stuff for our typical, like, if you're like watching gold and trying to see what are going on in the markets, you have like, websites and people who write who you
Right.
generally know they're going to say common sense things. Well, this is a whole new, virology or
Exactly.
and so I, don't know where to go. And I go and look on, TV and CNN, and I'm sure all they're talking about is like breaking down every word that Trump said and every time he was mean to a reporter. And nobody's having a panel of doctors on, or, if they do, there's like 2 Democratic operatives, a Republican operative, a Joe Biden proxy, and then one doctor who gets to say like 3 minutes of stuff on a panel. And there's not sophisticated debates about what's going on. Hell, like half the time the expert they have is like, somebody paid for by Bill Gates. And I'm, not saying that in a conspiracy sense, but just like, Bill Gates isn't an expert either. And the people he invests money in, that doesn't mean that they're the ones that have this thing right. And yeah, it seems to me that everybody is presenting this through political bias. And so I guess just on a personal level, I think libertarians in general probably feel this way, that it's just hard to find news on this. And so it's hard to know how to react and how safe it is to push back against the government's intrusions here.
Yeah, that's definitely been my struggle. Like you said, it's a whole new wheelhouse, and I have, I've studied economics and I've studied the gold markets. Now I've been involved in that for years, so I have enough knowledge and enough background, and I've read enough of these people to know the people that I can trust and the people that are coming from I know their biases, I know their quirks. This is a whole new world for most of us, and the thing that's frustrating to me is this notion, and it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with Facebook, where they, they're going to defer everything to the WHO. Science isn't monolithic, and there are disagreements among highly qualified and respected medical professionals on this. And, there was I wish I could remember his name, but there's a virologist, and I read a transcript of a very long transcript of an interview that he gave, and he was talking about the importance of herd immunity, and he felt like that the draconian lockdowns were actually going to be worse off in the long run because they're not allowing people to be exposed, and that a more rational approach would have been to shelter in place people that have pre-existing conditions and are vulnerable. Anyway, he made a very science-based argument that is contrary to the popular narrative. Now, why is he wrong just because he's not part of the government establishment? And in fact, he made the point, somebody asked him, what do you think of Dr. Fauci, or however you pronounce that dude's name? And he goes, well, I'll just say this, I'm not paid by the government, so I don't have to agree with him. So, it is very difficult. And like I said, I think it's just I think it's important to look at those official sources, look at the alternative sources, and use your own brain, your own reasoning power to make decisions as best you can, recognizing that your knowledge is not going to be perfect. And that's where our own personal risk preferences are going to come in. Some people are more risk averse than others. And, quite frankly, I told my wife the other day, we're surrounded by germs all the time. I'm not going to stay in my house the rest of my life. I'm not going to wear a mask everywhere I go. I'm just not going to do it. If I get coronavirus and die, I get it and die. There are certain things that I want to do in my life that are important to living life that I'm not going to sacrifice because I'm scared of a virus. And I think, again, we all have to make those decisions within our own range of preferences. It kind of goes to the whole idea from von Mises of human action. We all have preferences. They're different, and we act on them in different ways.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I have been thinking about, just the way that we're viewing the coronavirus as statistics, and that not that every death isn't sad and tragic, but at the same time, people die, and people have a very wide and different view of death. And I was very concerned about, I know there's like certain Jewish Orthodox traditions where they're going to ignore the coronavirus, and this has been something that's come up in New York and in Israel, where they're just not following the regulations because for them the I guess I'm not an expert on their religion, but generally, like death isn't the worst consequence in life. And, the way you live life is the way you live life. And, God will protect you. And if God doesn't, then God doesn't. And
Right.
That's okay. And it seems that the way that we're looking at the coronavirus in this very statistical concept doesn't allow that to factor in at all. And that would maybe be something that would factor in we had less government, where you can make the choice for yourself, where this isn't intrusive enough. Like when I go out to lunch with a friend, I decide that no matter how dangerous it is, I'm not going to wear a mask, because that personal social conduct is just so important, and it gives life meaning. You could live a pretty empty life, but that's just never considered in the government. Say it's just statistical. How can we keep people living longer, I suppose?
Yeah. I saw an article that was making the case that the number of traffic deaths in the last month has dropped significantly because we're all staying at home. And that goes to the point that we could be close to 100% safe. We could build ourselves a plastic bubble and live in it. As long as we could find somebody that was willing to bring us food and water, we could live in that for years and probably never get sick and never hurt ourselves. But who the hell wants to live in a plastic bubble? We could eliminate traffic deaths if we banned cars. Nobody's willing to do that. Again, it gets to this whole idea. I think we're developing a theme here. What are our risk preferences? And the thing about something like this is it's constantly in our face in the media. It'll be interesting to look back at statistics, once we get through several months, and look back and see if there were more deaths in overall, like if you look at all of the deaths in the United States in March of 2020 and compare that to the number of deaths in 2019. If that number is not significantly higher, then that's going to tell us that the coronavirus wasn't really that big of an impact overall on society. We're not going to know the answers to a lot of this stuff for months. And I'm afraid we're not going to know a lot of it for years, because the powers that be have a vested interest in making us feel like that all of the actions that they took were justified, whether they were or not.
So I wanted to, getting back to this Kentucky thing, one of the things that I thought I saw was a similar kind of touching of a nerve as you had in Virginia with the gun owners, where at least, especially the way the liberals were talking about and treating these people who wanted to go to church, it was in the same way they talked about the people they are willing to take away guns from. And it sounded very much like there were some liberals use the National Guard or whatever kind of police force they could to, if necessary, kill people to confiscate their guns. And I'm worried that we're touching on that nerve. Now, in Virginia, I think one of the positives was sheriffs were standing up and saying that they weren't going to enforce that. Have you seen that at all in Kentucky or anywhere in the U.S.? And also, do you see that, because since you understand Kentucky a little bit better, what do you think about that being kind of the same nerve?
I'm not sure about. I'm not in Kentucky anymore. I'm in Florida, so it's hard for me to really gauge those two things, compare those two things. I've not heard of any sheriffs taking any kind of stand in Kentucky. Although I just read an article before we started this interview that there are 4 sheriffs in Michigan that have said they're not going to enforce some of the draconian orders that the Michigan governor has put down. And even earlier, it's been a couple of weeks ago, there was a sheriff in Maine that said that he wasn't planning on enforcing that governor's decrees. So there are some sheriffs that are standing up for that kind of local, protect my citizens. I do think it's touching on a nerve among some people, but I think really the momentum of public opinion, the momentum in public opinion in parts of Virginia, really, if you got outside of Northern Virginia Beltway area, the vast majority of Virginians are pro-gun and wanted nothing to do with with these gun control things that were coming down. This is a strange dynamic politically where you have a very small region of this state, because it has such a large population. It basically can dictate to the rest of the state, what to do. And so there were so many. I mean, like virtually every county in Virginia outside of Northern Virginia had, at least done some type of resolution protesting the gun control. I don't think you're seeing that in Kentucky. I think it's a relatively small group of people. And I think the overall public opinion is probably in favor of the governor at this point. Now, it'll be interesting to see if he keeps this lockdown going for another month or so, if the public opinion starts to shift. Because, in some ways, I think people think this is kind of cool. We're a part of a big crisis here. We're working together and we're standing together. Well, when the shelves are really empty at the grocery stores and you really start feeling the economic crunch of this, it might not be so fun, and people might start demanding that things get opened up again.
So, with the government just kind of declaring emergency powers and dictates, and the governor under whatever constitutional authority or whatever decides that nobody could leave their house, my guess is that they could also just start taking other resources and applying it to the coronavirus that they want. And so I saw this article of yours today over at the 10th Amendment Center titled "Joint Law Enforcement are creating a national police state." And I thought to myself as I'm reading this article, there's about what you have here, 60 fugitive U.S. Marshals are on 60 fugitive task forces. Well, maybe those fugitive task forces, the fugitive becomes people who are violating quarantine. Mm-hmm. So just how massive is this national police state? Because I think it's important to know, because I could see them, flipping the switch and all this being directed towards enforcing coronavirus lockdown.
Yeah, that's the problem with all of this. So we've seen this really since the 1970s, and it really kind of started to percolate because of the war on drugs. What do you know? The war on drugs causing yet another problem. And so we started seeing these joint task forces with state, local, and federal law enforcement to crack down on the drugs. And of course, as with all things government, it has grown over time. As of 2016, the DEA had 271 anti-drug task forces across the United States. And that's just the anti-drug task forces. You also have violent gang task forces, fugitive task forces, like you mentioned. The ATF has a national explosives task force. You have all of these joint forces. And the federal money drives all of this. The state and local law enforcement are more than happy to be involved in this stuff because it's a cash cow, and it opens the door to asset forfeiture, which we've talked about before. And it really dictates policing. So instead of focusing on solving the murder in your town or, getting your car back that was stolen by the car thief, your police department is partnered up with the feds worrying about the guy with 30 pounds of weed. So it's really shifted policing. But you make a really good point in terms of once this structure is in place, and it is in place, it can be used for virtually anything for the crisis of the day. And what we've really seen, the task force issue, I haven't really seen that playing out, although, as you said, it could, like you said, if the quarantine violator becomes the fugitive. But where we've really seen it is with the surveillance state. We've had this same type of surveillance state built through the federal government, started after 9/11. It started before that, really, but it really ramped up after 9/11, where we started seeing the fusion centers, what they call the information sharing environment, where all of this data that's being gathered up by cops is being stored in these databases. And now we're seeing this surveillance state being used to monitor social distancing. I wrote an article about this that has not been published yet. It'll be published at 10thamendmentcenter.com soon. But just how they're using warrantless phone surveillance, basically location tracking, to track coronavirus. Now, so far, they say it's anonymized, that they're not, there's no names attached to this. But we know that in China and other countries, they have actually used people's cell phones to find quarantine violators and make sure that they are locked down appropriately. So we're just a step away from that if it's not already happening. And that goes to show that when you allow these overreaching government forces to come together, and let's be very clear about this, the federal government has no business in law enforcement at all. There's like 3 crimes in the Constitution that the federal government is supposed to be even involved in: treason, crimes on the high seas, and counterfeiting. It's not supposed to be involved in all of these other things to begin with, but it has made itself the primary policing force through all of these joint task forces, through all of the money, through the fusion centers, through the surveillance state. And what we've ended up with is this giant network that can be used by the government whenever it wants to. And, the disturbing thing about it is we're just one tyrant away from having this mechanism used in very nefarious ways. It's interesting with surveillance. Back in the 1970s, Frank Church, who was a senator, he said that at that time in the 1970s, that the intelligence gathering capabilities of the federal government already gave the person who controlled it the power for, quote, total tyranny. He said that before everybody had cell phones, before everybody was on the internet, before everybody had email. Imagine what power the federal government has with the surveillance state today. It's using it to track quarantiners right now and social distancing. Who knows what it's going to be used for in the future? That's why we have to make sure that there are limits placed on this stuff, that there are warrant requirements, that there are data sharing walls that prevent this data from being shared into databases. All of these things are extremely important because you never know when this is going to be used in a really bad way.
Right. Well, it's so important there that you bring up 9/11, because after that crisis, the government sees so much power, Patriot Act, war. And it seems for sure that even if there's not a whole lot, we feel safe doing now or have a good idea of what direction to go now, we have to make sure this stuff is repealed when we're done with it. The last question I have for you is just wondering, I know there's a lot of good momentum with Defend the Guard before this, and, it's not the first thing on everybody's mind right now. Are state legislators even up and going? Are they in session? My guess is that even if they are, the Defend the Guard Act is probably on the bottom of the list in a lot of places with all the coronavirus stuff going on. But I updates on Defend the Guard.
Most of the state legislatures have either adjourned completely for the year, just wrapped up their sessions, or are on recess, until further notice. Basically everything is at a standstill. There are some legislatures that are meeting remotely, but they're mostly doing it to deal with the emergency measures and things relating to coronavirus. You're not seeing any actual business being done. I suspect that we won't see much happen with Defend the Guard, which is a shame. We had it introduced and we were close to a dozen states. But at this point, I don't really see that moving forward given the dynamics of the political world. So our plan right now is just kind of sit tight to see how things play out for the rest of this year and hopefully jump on it strong again in 2021. But there's definitely growing momentum for this. We were seeing a lot of interest, it's an extremely important issue. Just because we're dealing with this crisis now the warfare state is still churning on. I guarantee you they're still making bombs. They're probably still bombing people, So
No, well, didn't you know we actually need to buy more bombs and torpedoes right now,
of course.
because we had to keep the weapons supply chains up and running. So rather than them being non-essential personnel, because who needs a bomb to fight a virus? No, it's actually essential personnel, and we're gonna crank up the orders.
Right. Well, didn't we send the military out into the Pacific somewhere to do drug interdiction or something? I remember seeing that.
Yeah, it's was it the very eastern Pacific, but mostly in the Caribbean and off the coast of Venezuela, because they're concerned about the 7% of cocaine that comes through Venezuela versus the 80 or so percent that eastern Pacific, sea line, Peru, Colombia, and everything.
So
with everybody kind of identifying the real threat being Maduro is that they're claiming.
I was going to say, so in other words, we want to saber rattle at Venezuela. Good plan.
Yep. Yeah, in the middle of a coronavirus crisis where you already have one ship and a sailor on the USS Theodore Roosevelt dying of coronavirus, the best idea is, of course, to fight the war state, or add more to the war state and deploy these several other ships to the Caribbean. But Mike, thanks so much for coming on the show again. I got a feeling I'm gonna have to have you on again to talk about this stuff, especially once we're looking at making sure none of these programs become permanent. And while we voluntarily decide to go along with these quarantines, once we decide that we're done going along with them, we're done going. And it was our decision and not the government's. So tell people where to find your work. 10thamendmentcenter.com. And I've one of the good things about the quarantine is I've been able to watch Mike Bolden's podcast live every day, Paths to Liberty, 12:30 Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Yeah, that's a fantastic show. Bolden does a great job. 10thamendmentcenter.com. Since we're not having state legislatures meeting right now, I'm doing a lot more long form writing. So like the article that you talked about the joint task forces. I wrote one today actually about how a 1967 meat packaging act has set the stage for some of the disruptions in the meat supply chain that we're seeing today. So interesting things like that. So a lot of stuff that I wouldn't be able to get to normally this time of year. I'm doing some kind of fun longer form writing over there. So 10thamendmentcenter.com. You can always check out my website at michaelmaharrey.com. And if you're interested in following along what's going on with the economic stuff, which I think is far more dangerous than the virus, you can check out schiffgold.com/news. I write at least 2 articles a day over there on what's going on with the economy and the Federal Reserve and the stimulus and all of the crazy economic stuff that's coming down the pike. So those are the 3 spots.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, man.